Joining us now is author Andrew Marantz. He's also a writer for The New Yorker. And he just published a book titled Antisocial: Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. The book's not out till October. I just don't want people to get confused, but it is available on Amazon now for pre-order.
All right, great. When will it be out? The specific date?
In October. So there's a lot more for us to talk about then, but yeah, it's almost ready to go out into the world.
Great, wonderful. So I'm really glad that you're joining us today. This is a pretty big topic and a conversation that I think needs to be had on a regular basis as the social media landscape changes, the online landscape changes, and the way that we handle some of this extremist rhetoric changes. So let me start off by asking you about a story that was actually published over the weekend, because while we have these debates about the best way to move forward with these social media platforms, the Trump administration and the goons that work for him are working pretty aggressively to target journalists who happen to publish anything that shines a negative light on the Trump administration. And so they're doing opposition research. They're actually using social media platforms to find any disparaging information about them. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, because what they're doing is focusing on anti-Semitic or possibly racist content that was put out by journalists in the past. And it's an interesting tactic considering the anti-Semitism and racism coming from this administration.
Yeah, well, certainly Trump likes to use his old mentor Roy Cohn's advice, which is to kind of go on the attack, never go on the offensive. Whenever he's accused of anti-Semitism, which is the example you raise, he accuses others of anti-Semitism, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, that sort of thing. So that is a very familiar playbook. The way that technology plays into it, I think, is interesting, because technology, we're kind of stuck in this slightly dead end part of the debate right now, because a lot of the social media technology is so new. It's only about 15 years old at this point. So it's very easy for people to look at a particular slice of it and say, oh, this is good or bad for my team. Certainly how President Trump seems to look at it, and not really see that it's much broader than that. I mean, social media technology, search technology, these things are just so big. They're not left or right. They're not good or bad. They're worthy of examination and critique, obviously. And there are certain elements of it, certain programs, certain technologies that Google was going to provide to China, for example, that where the plug was pulled on. There are specific programs that have massive effects on our world that obviously deserve to be talked about in specific ways and critiqued. But the idea that this is just sort of a tool that a side can use to dismantle or undermine the other side, I think is just not productive when anyone does it. It's particularly scary, of course, when it's being done by people who have the power of the government at their disposal. And, to the extent that the First Amendment is meaningful, it's meaningful when it's a protection against the government shutting down speech it doesn't like for nefarious or political reasons.
So one thing that I thought was fascinating, and it certainly blindsided many on the left, myself included, was how the right-wing extremists did hijack the conversation online. And so can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit and how that started and where we are today with that?
Yeah, it's a big story, and it's one that I go into in my book in a lot of detail. I think, one thing that might be worth clarifying is there's a lot of things that get coded as right-wing extremism, but I actually think it does a disservice to our friends on the right to call it that. It's even alt-right itself was a clever branding move that was thought up by Richard Spencer in 2008 to kind of rebrand white supremacy as this fresh alternative kind of new conservatism. And there's been a lot of ideological confusion, both on the left, on the right, and sort of from apolitical people, to sort of thinking, well, this is just what conservatism looks like now. And I don't think that's true. And it's actually created a situation where nobody knows who they can talk to. People on the left don't know who they can talk to on the right in order to have an actual productive political conversation, the kind of old kind of congressional horse trading. I want this policy, you want that policy. Because when you come down to Richard Spencer style ethno-nationalism, you don't have anyone to talk to. That's just an untenable, offensive, horrible idea and set of preferences. And so if that's what the new conservatism looks like, then there's really no discussion to be had. I don't think it is, but I do think that that's been a kind of branding mistake that a lot of people have made.
So Andrew, I'm gonna push back quite a bit on what you just said, because I know that there are members of the right wing who they act as chameleons, really. I mean, depending on who they talk to, they'll present themselves as either moderates who think that the true right-wing extremism and the right-wing terrorism that we've seen in this country is deplorable. They don't agree with it. But then on the other hand, they never push back on the Trump administration and the bigotry coming from the executive branch. And if you look at the voters, 94% of Republican voters support Donald Trump. They think he's doing an excellent job. They have no problem with children in cages. They have no problem with the dozens of migrants who have died under US control, or US custody, I should say. And so, while you might make the argument that someone simply being complicit in what the Trump administration is doing is not the same as being extremists themselves, I do think that they serve as apologists, for the right-wing extremists that we see today.
Yeah, I definitely take your point. There's a lot of horrific stuff being done by the Trump administration in the name of conservatism. However you want to parse the language of that, there's all kinds of untenable, unconscionable things happening. And there are plenty of people in the government and outside of the government who made up Trump's base previously who should be standing up to it and aren't. I think that's absolutely true. The question to me is where the kind of essence of this lies and how permanent it is versus how amenable to change it is. Mm-hmm. If we see the essence of conservatism as being nothing but kind of ideas that have no place in the American firmament, then there's sort of, there's a power struggle, and that's kind of all we're left with. If there is something to the kind of classic idea of Burkean conservatism that can be worked with, then that's a different situation. Now, I'm not actually here to resolve that. That's a huge sort of question of political philosophy. But I think that basically the point I'm trying to make is these things are really changeable and contingent in my view. And the fact that Trump steamrolled over the Republican Party is both a horrifying thing to watch and also in a weird way kind of shows you how these things can change in an instant and they can change back. I don't think that it serves anyone to get stuck in a mold of thinking, well, now that we have the internet, we are stuck with Trumpism forever. The internet can be used for all kinds of different vectors. I think the key challenge here in our political moment is it's much easier to use viral memes to sow fear and false rumors and discord than it is to build a bedrock of kind of trust and civil dialogue, or, civil is a weighted word these days, but just actual sort of the roots of democratic discourse are much harder to do than to freak people out or to sow them misinformation or to give them racism that gets their heart pumping. So that is a genuine challenge. I guess I would just caution against the left getting stuck into this notion of, well, we just have to dig in and fight this thing that is now our permanent enemy, when in fact, the thing that is the enemy now, it might be more amenable to change than people think.
Okay, that's a fascinating perspective. We do differ a little bit when it comes to that issue. I mean, just to give you a sense of where I'm at, I think that Democrats and the left overall have been so willing to work with the right, historically speaking, and they've been steamrolled. And I think that the Overton window, we can give various examples showing how the country has moved to the right, if you want to use the Overton window as a measure of it. But I do want to just quickly talk about the way very various social media platforms have handled cases of extremism, because I remember when the internet and these various platforms, Reddit, Facebook, YouTube first started, and it was all about protecting free speech. It was all about allowing for people to share their point of view regardless of how controversial it is. But I don't think anybody really understood that there would be the rise of some unsavory figures, the Alex Joneses of the world, the Milo Yiannopoulos of the world. What is your take on the way that these platforms have handled those various figures?
Yeah, I think you get it exactly right. These things were so based in this sort of fundamental, one could say absolutist notion of free speech, that they really weren't prepared to deal with the case by case of an Alex Jones, of a Milo Yiannopoulos, it's harder in any specific instance than it is to have a flat policy. And as I sort of write about in my articles and in the book and everything, the only perfectly consistent policy you can have as a content moderator is to say, do whatever you want as long as it's legal. Mm-hmm. If you sort of tie your hands as a platform and say, well, we're just going to do whatever the government allows, that makes you really consistent. But it doesn't help you actually cultivate good community to kick out people who no sane person would want to be using their tools to propagate violence. So you're right, it was way too lax for way too long. And now comes the hard part of trying to deal with what does it mean to actually enforce content moderation. It's really messy, it's really tricky, it's not always consistent. And it's not clear that just going around banning people would necessarily solve the problem. Then you might chase people off into echo chambers where they keep doing lots of evil stuff, but sort of out of the sight of anyone who might be a moderating influence. So it's extremely tricky. At least we're now starting to deal with it, where I think that the social media platforms kind of had a run of 10 or 15 years where they didn't have to confront these problems at all, even though they arguably should have been confronting them the whole time. Mm-hmm. So now we have to actually get to the heart of the issue, which is people don't always behave the way you want them to behave. They do horrific, terrifying stuff that leads to real world violence. What can we use as levers, both positive and negative, to try to clean that stuff up? Because the original vision of these platforms, I'm sure you would agree, was really, desirable,
Absolutely.
Having this marketplace of ideas. I think everybody wants that vision to come to fruition. It just really, really did not go the way any well-meaning person would have wanted. And I guess the reason that I think it's useful to get outside of the frame of our day-to-day politics is that I think there are more people. I certainly hear you on the Overton window stuff. I write about the Overton window stuff a lot. The Overton window has also shifted in favor of same-sex marriage, in favor of trans rights, in favor of drug legalization. There are multiple vectors it can go in. And I think it's worth taking a broader view sometimes and thinking, we do want to get to a place, and by we, I mean just people of goodwill. Mm-hmm. We want to get to a place where there is this open marketplace of ideas and people are trying to build a better future together. We just had way more hurdles to get there than we realized. And so we have to clean that stuff up and then get back to the original vision with a lot of amendments to deal with the darker parts of human nature.
All right, Andrew Marantz, writer, staff writer for The New Yorker, and also author of the upcoming book, Antisocial and Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation. Please check it out. It's out in October. And Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Thank you. More soon, I hope.
Did you know that TYT Network is now available on YouTube's new streaming platform, YouTube TV? Get access to full TYT episodes and exclusive shows by signing up for YouTube TV today. All new subscribers get a 7-day free trial, so head over to youtube.tv and search for the TYT Network channel.